And John, how's Tobias?
Find him.
He's
You're
muted.
muted, John.
Unmute yourself, John.
Can't hear anything.
John, you're muted.
Yeah, unmute yourself, John.
Sorry. He's not a fan of the fireworks, we found out last night.
Oh, poor thing.
Yeah.
Neither am I.
On my shoulder most of the night last night.
Oh,
So hopefully there'll be no fireworks tonight, but I'm not holding my breath.
Ben and Kay, are things going well in Florida?
So far.
so far.
Good.
It's busy.
Yeah.
It looks beautiful there.
Ah,
Is it hot?
That's virtual.
it's very, very hot. Very hot.
Oh, it's virtual.
Yeah.
Good morning.
Hey,
Hey,
James.
hey,
James.
James.
Good to see you all.
Hi, James.
What? No.
James, is that a Houston Astros cap?
No, sir. It's Alta, Utah. Alta, Utah is where I go snow skiing in the winter. So
Oh,
thinking on this 95-degree day about being at 11,000 feet elevation in Utah.
I love it.
you didn't get to do that this year, did you?
Yes, I did it right before it's funny that the first week in March I was there. And they shut down the week after I was there. So I was lucky to get that in, but I hope that they are open this coming season.
Hope so.
Who's playing?
Morning, Ed and Judy.
Did they say us?
All right. Well, I have 9:45 by my
You should have said.
watch. So that means it is time for us to start. I will invite you to go ahead for the first part, to go ahead and mute yourselves for while we do the video. That will just let everybody hear the video. And then when we come back, I'll let you unmute yourself. When we get ready to have discussion, I'm gonna have to keep myself on speaker view, and that's for the live stream video. So I can only see whoever is speaking. So there is a way in the chat feature to raise your hand. So if you do that, I will see that, or you can just kind of unmute yourself and speak or wave your hand. There's a couple people that are also monitoring the room and will let me know that you want to say something or just kind of interrupt in, and we will let everybody have a chance to speak who wants to speak today. Our video presenter today is named Reggie Williams. He is assistant professor of Christian ethics at McCormick Theological Seminary. in Chicago. McCormick is one of our Presbyterian seminaries. William's book is that he's drawing his work from today is called Bonhoeffer's Black Jesus, Harlem's Renaissance Theology and Ethic. And it examines the impact of exposure to Christianity in Harlem during the Harlem Renaissance and on Bonhoeffer in his activism during the Nazi regime. So he has a very interesting video. So I am gonna get ready and share my screen for you. And here we go.
Well, officially as a career, I'm a Christian ethicist. I like to confessionally describe myself as theological ethics, a theological ethicist. And the work that drives me in theological ethics, one might say, to use the technical term of the field, is theological anthropology. So the way we think about humanity in relationship to God. In general, one might say that theology or Christianity has calibrated humanity. We got a helicopter going over now. It's going by, okay. Is that what it means to be human in the West has been calibrated to a false and very harmful ideal with regards to the notion of race. Race is not something that is, it's not an ongoing conversation in the Bible. It's not historical. It's as old as the United States and as recent as the slave trade. And it's fixed what we understand to be human around the notion of an ideal. And it is the recalibration of humanity, especially theologically. Theology is just one of the engines to mobilize this distorted notion of human.
What was the ideal and who fixed it?
Well, the ideal is white. When we talk about race, we're really not talking about categories of human being. We're really talking about a central idealized human being around which all of humanity gravitates in various different manifestations that we describe as diversity. But it's the category is an ideal, and that's the fixture. All of the history of race has been the effort to stabilize this central notion of white. Christ becomes an idealized human being, white.
Yeah, I'm saying Jesus not white. I'm saying the notion of Jesus as white, the understanding of Jesus as white, corresponds with the history of idealized humanity that has damaged really the whole world. Practices of domination.
Hold on 1 second. I think we have a problem. Give me 1 second. I think there is an echo.
I think a lot of that interference comes from the sound in the airport where he's being interviewed.
Yeah, I think also the YouTube live video was unfortunately not muted on my side. So I'm going to start it again. Sorry about that.
Officially as a career, I'm a Christian ethicist. I like to confessionally describe myself as theological ethics, a theological ethicist. And the work that drives me in theological ethics. One might say, I mean, to use the technical term of the field, is theological anthropology. So the way we think about humanity in relationship to God. In general, one might say that theology or Christianity has calibrated humanity. We got a helicopter going over now. It's going by. Okay.
It's life.
Is that what it means to be human in the West has been calibrated to a false and very harmful ideal with regards to the notion of race. Race is not something that is, it's not an ongoing conversation in the Bible. It's not historical. It's as old as the United States and as recent as the slave trade. And it's fixed what we understand to be human around the notion of an ideal. And it is the recalibration of humanity, especially theologically. Theology is just one of the engines to mobilize this distorted notion of human.
What was the ideal and who fixed it?
Well, the ideal is white. When we talk about race, we're really not talking about categories of human being. We're really talking about a central idealized human being around which all of humanity gravitates, and various manifestations that we describe as diversity. But it's the category is an ideal, and that's the fixture. All of the history of race has been the effort to stabilize this central notion of white. Christ becomes an idealized human being, white.
Saying Jesus is not white?
Yeah, I'm saying Jesus is not white. I'm saying the notion of Jesus as white, the understanding of Jesus as white, corresponds with the history of idealized humanity that has damaged really the whole world. Practices of domination, imperialism, colonization, cruelty, the pursuit of ideal communities populated with ideal people. That is the structure. That's what racism is. Systems and structures for whites only. And theologically, Christianity has been a partnering engine, or at least a mobilizing engine. Different manifestations of Christianity has been a mobilizing engine for the practice of idealized humanity, which is basically white supremacy. Why does the church partner with the dominant narrative? Some may argue that the church is now partner with the dominant narrative, that the church has been a mobilizing force of the dominant narrative. That, for example, in the practice of colonization, I'm forgetting, I believe it's the 15th century, that Treaty of Tordesillas, if I'm pronouncing that correct, gave colonies, the practice of colonies, the empire in the practice of colonization, authority over the churches within their colonies, split the Western world between the East and the West over in the West, and gave Portugal and Spain power over the colonies within their, power over the churches within their colonies. They basically split the world. The Pope gave the world in a manner not unlike, the Promised Land, which was a supersessionist practice that saw the church as the true Israel and the chosen people, the ideal people. That language of the chosen people, the Christian, co-opting of the narrative of Israel, was a mobilizing force for Europeans having authority over everything related to heaven and earth.
I didn't learn that in church.
Yeah, related to heaven and earth, everything. And it was, again, more than just religion was at stake, however. Religion was a mobilizing force for land grabbing, for financial acquisition, especially in the way that Christianity gave logic to the buying and selling of human beings in the slave trade. So the legitimizing process of buying and selling human beings and the practice of capitalism in the West. All of that stuff calibrated humanity and Christianity towards this ideal, white, masculine, European. Now, that is a Christianity. That's not Christianity writ large. That is a Christianity. That's a very dominant Christianity in the West, but it's not Christianity in total. Just like just like there have been different kinds of Christians in the Western world. Let me back up. There have been different kinds of Christians, much like there was also different kinds of practices of Judaism. You get your Sadducees, and you get your Pharisees, you get your priestly class, and so forth. And then you have followers of the way. Some were in cahoots with the empire, others were crucified by the empire. And they were all Jewish people. We've got Christians who are in cahoots with the empire and Christians who have stood in opposition to the empire, following Christ, a different Christ than the one who is idealized as white and European.
Where is Christ?
Christ is always with those whose backs are pressed against the wall by politically oppressive regimes. I borrow from Howard Thurman when I say that. Christ is where he says, in Matthew 25, in society as the hungry, as the imprisoned, as the naked, as the thirsty.
Those are metaphors.
They're metaphors in a sense, but they are also ontological truths. So, I wrote a book on Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Bonhoeffer's experience in Harlem. And I think there's something to learn from what Bonhoeffer says when he describes who Jesus is. He describes Jesus as Stellvertretung.
As what?
Stellvertretung, it's a German word. It's a big German word. It means vicarious representation. To put it short, when we in our sin and our shame can't stand before God, Christ stands in for us, becomes vicarious representation for all of humankind. And he believes that that's an ontological thing. Christ has stood in for all of us. We find ourselves now only in Christ. When you encounter another human being, you are not encountering just that other human being. You are also encountering Christ, who stands in for all of humanity. So when we have our pursuits of ideals, and this person aesthetically does not fit the ideal, aesthetically, financially, sexually, whatever, they don't fit the ideal, and you shun that person as you're looking for the ideal community. You are not shunning just another person. That person comes to you as Christ comes to you. You are shunning Christ, which is an important understanding. So when he says in Matthew 25, I was hungry and you did not feed me. I was thirsty, you did not give me drink. That's not just a metaphor. That's not just, I'm disappointed that you treated somebody else like that. You have an opportunity to love Christ in your interaction with your neighbor. Wendell Berry has written an interesting book called The Hidden Wound. It's an old book. But in this book, he talks about the plight of the slave owner in church with his slave. And he says he talks about the language of plight when he's talking about his faith. When this person recognizes that the slave that he owns has a body with a soul that's as worthy of salvation as his own. What happens to his Christianity in that regard? He recognizing that that person has a soul that's as worthy of salvation as his own. His Christianity becomes abstract, it becomes about doctrine only, about right belief. Abstract and hyper-spiritual, not about concrete social interaction, because that would disrupt his practice of slavery, his practice of owning a person's body. It becomes about belief. We shed the gospel of social concerns, about I-thou interaction, turn it into spiritual stuff and right doctrine. That's the plight of a lot of our Christianity in America, where we can have so many churches all over the country and high numbers of incarceration, high numbers of poverty, high numbers of homeless people, which are primarily children. We're all these Christians in America. Christians who understand a connection between Jesus and justice are different than Christians who do not. Christians who understand a connection between Jesus and justice are more apt to be concerned about social interaction with the neighbor, about social interaction, about systems and structures. The language of relationship, even I'll problematize that a little bit because it can be reduced to individuals, which is a very Western and American thing. And when you have life and meaning reduced to the individual in individual social interactions, you miss the way that systems and structures have been arranged as biopolitical schemes around the ideal human being, to organize societies biopolitically around the notion of the ideal person for the ideal community. You miss that when you talk about individuals and individual relationships. It's very evangelical, which is historically very problematic. It's important to pay attention to systems and structures. How do you get to that? How do you talk about that? Well, understanding a connection between the way of Jesus and justice is very important. Jesus was not talking about righteousness in an individual sense, which is a hypermorality even. It gets the language righteousness can be understood as kind of a hypermorality. Here, again, read individual moral pursuits. But righteousness also understood tzedakah, mishpat, biblical words that also translate into justice. And here, justice understood in a restorative sense, when in the Garden of Eden, example, relationship when Adam and Eve sinned, broke the covenant. They broke relationship between God and humanity, between humankind and the rest of creation, and between each other. Justice in that regard is not retribution or them being punished and punishment fitting the crime, but the restoration of relationship between each other, between them and God and between humankind and one another, between humankind and creation. It's the restoration. And that would be a better way of understanding what the way of Jesus is restoring, setting relationships right, which you don't have when you have a notion of one ideal human, or ideal humanity, ideal human types, in community for ideal human types, and just individual relationships. You got to break down the systems and structures that continue to dominate and separate people, argue for the practices of capitalism that leave people in poverty and suffering, and so forth.
What gives you hope that can begin like that can be broken open so that through that there'd be a new creation, a new we?
What gives me hope about the possibility of undoing systems and structures that abuse and oppress is that it's not my job only. And I'm not passing the buck here. I'm talking about participating with God in what God is doing in Christ in the world. And here, Christ not as a fetishized, idealized thing, an object, an idol of the worship of white supremacy, which is what a lot of Christianity is. But the Christ who is present in Palestine as a poor Jew in a colonized state, speaking, "Thus saith the Lord," in a prophetic sense, to undo systems and structures. Jesus of liberation. This is God's work in the world. And those of us who say yes to Christ are saying yes to this, to participating with Christ, with God, in what God is doing in Christ in the world. That's hope. And in order for, I love this quote from Paulo Freire, and I'll paraphrase it, but in order for the oppressed to wage their war for their freedom, they must see oppression not as a closed room in which there is no escape, but as a moment, as a situation in which we can, and I'm paraphrasing still, open a door. Hope in the process of oppression, or in the context of oppression, is what drives us towards liberation. And Christ is our hope.
before we have a discussion, I have a question I want you to think about. And I have it on a slide for you to look at. Williams reveals that racism is a construction of systems and structures around an ideal race, white, European, and masculine. What is your view of this from where you live? Is it in your sight, in your periphery, out of sight? And I'll let you unmute yourself, and anybody want to respond to that?
Well, for one, I'll just say that I grew up in an area where there were very few Blacks, there were very few Indians, and it was never really much of an issue. So I've never really understood racism until, you know, I went off to college and began to see some of it there. And then after that, of course, and I guess I saw some in trips in the South when I can remember as a real young person seeing, you know, restrooms that said white only. Didn't understand that. But anyway, I, for one, has never really experienced the negativity until actually, I guess it was when Martin Luther King was killed and I was in Chicago and I saw the race riots there. That was my first experience with racism, and that's when I began to get it.
Thank you. Others?
John, I will just say that I have really, over the last, since the beginning of the year, come to understand this so much better. I thought I understood it, but I only understood the very surface of it. I only understood the whites only on the restroom. I didn't understand the systems and the structures in our society, economically, socially. I didn't understand all of that, and I'm beginning to understand it. And I really appreciated his connections to what Richard Rohr calls the universal Christ. And when in his book, he says, so many Christians in America are Christians at the kindergarten level. And connecting that to what this guy says about seeing Christ only on an individual level, and growing up in the Bible Belt and so much emphasis on this personal relationship, just concerned with how you were doing with God and Christ and Jesus, and not seeing your responsibility for sharing that more than just on the individual level, but changing systems and structures for justice.
Thank you.
John, this is Bob Osborne. I think his characterization is a very good one, and I think it probably explains a lot of our what happens in as we grew up in society. We accepted so many things, and without really trying to characterize it any further than that, I think that his definition is fairly accurate. The other thing I would say is that it's the second time I've heard the comment about the slave owner and the slave in church, and it may have been in the webinar from are well, they're at the seminary here. Anyway, they pointed out that led to a type of Christianity having to do with only the salvation of souls. And if they kept it to that, then they could justify the slavery if they just thought about the salvation of souls and not what it meant in terms of their everyday life and how they justified the slavery.
John, I was struck on Friday, listening as I always try to do to NPR, the reading of the Declaration of Independence. And for the first time, I heard that from the Black perspective. And it's their list of demands right now for life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. The one that particularly struck me was when they complained about King George sending in these savages engaging in brutal warfare, engaging in indiscriminate killing of women and children in their homes. And I thought, that's what our Black neighbors are saying about their neighborhoods right now.
Interesting.
I challenge you to listen to that sometime and think about it from the contemporary Black perspective. It's just stunning.
Interesting. Thank you. Other thoughts?
Well, the thing I'm thinking, this is Martha again, and this will be my last comment. I'm taking too much time, but the thing that I'm thinking about is there is some slave trade in the United States now, but it's very much underground. But we practice paying people an insufficient amount of money to live. You know, when we have people working full time and they still qualify for poverty providing programs like food stamps and childcare, and, you know, something is wrong. It is a form of slavery. It is part of the system that we could do something about through the electoral process and just raising the issues continually. If we quit thinking about how it affects us and the economy that we think we're dependent on, if we see it as restorative, it just puts it in a different light.
Thank you, Martha. I think your comments are good. And I also wanted to say, I should be a little embarrassed to say that this is probably the first 4th of July where I really considered, you know, how the slaves must have felt, you know, with the independence and they got no independence. And, oh, you know, how hypocritical the whole thing was, you know, how we were building this country and then we had slaves and they got no freedom. So I finally gave that a little more thought this year.
There is another NPR special where Frederick Douglass's grandchildren read his famous speech about what is the 4th of July to a slave. And I'd encourage you also to look for that one.
I saw that. That was wonderful.
Hey, Mary, in reading the Declaration, one thing that's interesting and sad to me is that, you know, when they list the grievances against King George, the reference to the merciless Indian savages whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. So what they're saying is that King George utilized Native American people against, you know, the white settlers. So,
and done in very racist language by the Declaration, yeah.
So there's like a lot of horrible stuff in there to pick apart. So thanks for reminding me of that.
Williams says that Christ is always with those whose backs are pressed against the wall by oppressive regimes. Christ is, in Matthew 25, in society as the hungry, as the imprisoned, as the naked, as the thirsty. If you shun people who are not the ideal, Williams says you are shunning Christ. How do we respond how do we respond to what Williams says as a community?
I think it's really important to recognize kind of where we are still having oppressive situations in our world. I mean, you look at when I was born and raised in Belmont, North Carolina, and I look at how the structure of our actual community was. There was a section for Blacks. Not that, so everybody said you had to live there, but it was just, it was almost kind of like Blacks were in this area and whites are in that area. And if we don't start recognizing just the oppression and just how we are setting up our communities, I think it's going to be very difficult to start that work and this work.
When he said, when our speaker said what he said about Christ being our intermediary before God and how Christ is in each one of us, I think I knew that, but when he said it, somehow it really clicked. I don't know why, but it really clicked for me. And I hope I carry that with me now. But your question, John, was about us as a community. We're all flawed, so we're failures no matter what we do, but at least we're trying right now. I mean, if we weren't doing stuff here in Davidson, if we weren't speaking out and getting involved, then that would really be condemning. But at least, we're trying. And so I'm taking some comfort of that. Now, the thing I worry about is that we'll run out of steam and we'll go back to our normal way of living, but we have to try to fight against that. But at least I take some comfort in the fact we're having this class. 2 years ago, it never would have crossed our minds to have this class. So at least we're doing something.
Joe, I agree. And I think what's important to what I try to keep in mind is that there are, those of us for whom not fighting is not an option. When you're a marginalized person and your very existence is on the line, you don't get a vacation. So I think part of building solidarity around race is to try to internalize that sense that, our BIPOC siblings, they don't get a day off. So that's kind of what helps me stay focused.
I think it can't be up to the legislature to do it. We've tried that several different ways, and we tried it in the school system. And, one of the first studies that I did here was about the Mecklenburg County schools, where they tried to desegregate and why they tried to legislate racism and to make everything equal. And legislation isn't going to do it. It's going to have to be the people and the churches. And I think that we as a church in Davidson, are trying to do things like Joe said. And I think that we should take comfort in the fact that we're trying, but we can't take comfort in the fact that it's not there. We have to individually, like they say, you can try to solve the problems of the world and you can't get it done. And maybe even the state, you can't get it done, but you can do it for yourself. And that's all you can do. And so we as individuals have to make sure that we recognize that it's our responsibility to try to accept everyone as an equal.
Jim Wallace, whom we listened to a couple of weeks ago, wrote a book about 20 years ago, I think it was, God's Politics. And he described politicians as people who walk around with wet fingers in the air to figure out which way the wind is blowing. What we need to be about is changing the way that the wind blows. And I get a sense that the winds have changed, and I hope we can make that happen, work on making that happen, and learn what we need to do to
rectify our own complicity in white supremacy.
I'm glad we're talking about this the way we are, but I think we still have to remember that we don't want to treat people of color as if they're children, or as if they need to listen to us and what ways that we see are the ways to solve problems. We need to listen a lot to what is being said there. And I think Gordon said it so well several weeks ago about talking about building that trust between communities. And I think if we don't do that, we're going to be, people are going to look at us very suspiciously as to maybe you've got a guilty conscience. Maybe that's why you're coming at this time with the circumstances in the world like they are. But this will die down. This will, as it has in the past. And I'm afraid that's the way we're going to be looked upon if we don't listen and really build those relationships with people of color.
Yeah, I agree with what Marjorie just said. And you have to realize that I can't change you. I can only change me. And, you know, I was sitting there talking to Margie about we human beings tend to want to cluster together with people of like mind. So that makes this new world even more difficult to comprehend and want to be a part of. But it's going to have to be, you know, I can't go out and say you're doing this wrong and have any traction whatsoever. So what I've got to do is figure out how I can change myself, my outlook, my perception of what's right and what's wrong in order to make a difference. So anyway.
For me, I grew up in Minnesota, pretty much a white state. Spent the last 43 years in Vermont, where we are right now. Again, a very, very white state. And I've come to realize that throughout my life, I've always had choices with everything, where I went to school, you know, where I lived. And I've come to realize that it's like being in a candy store and the white people go in and they can have any kind of candy they want. And the blacks go in and they get a penny piece of licorice. We haven't given them the choices that we have, whether we've taken them, whether we've just experienced them. But that has, through all this, as we educate ourselves, that because of, I guess, the way I grew up, I've come to realize that I've, you know, lived a very privileged life with choices, and that Black people haven't had those choices. And since moving to North Carolina, that has been a, you know, an eye opener for me. But I chose, and I had the choice to live in a community that is very devoid of Black people. And that's one thing that bothers me, that I'm not living in a diverse community as I'm trying to change.
Since the George Floyd murder, I've been watching CNBC in the mornings versus news, because it's much more balanced, and there are differing views, but it's all couched in business and what's good for the economy. And they've been very earnest in putting on every single Black leader they could find in business and investing, philanthropy, you name it. And there have been some really fascinating discussions that I would call economic justice. And there was a guy on that taught in a philanthropy role that talked about if they could just get the credit scores up 100 points in those communities, it's life-changing for them. You know, they can get a car, a mortgage, etc. And so outside of the Social Justice Committee, which I'm happily a part of, I am going to be focusing my efforts on the economic side wherever I can help, because that changes everything. If they can just get a decent credit score and get some loans.
Brad, that's a great point. And one of the things that we're having early discussions about is the capital campaign that DCPC is going to embark upon. And what can we do as part of that capital campaign that may entail some sort of reparations, and helping to develop stronger economic systems that benefit our Black neighbors is part of that. So I'm glad to hear that you're interested in that element of it.
On another somewhat concrete thought that's been in my head has to do, and I'm not a citizen of Davidson. I live just on the cusp, on the other side of Davidson, Cornelius. So I can't vote in Davidson stuff. And Heather, I hoped maybe you or Jane could speak to, why is there no Black representation on the Davidson political scene? Council, whatever. Is it not set up by zones that guarantees that they have a voice? We've talked about needing to listen to their voice, and they don't seem to have one.
Let me speak.
Yeah.
For
Go ahead, Mary.
There was historically, but what we have to remember is the Black community is not the Black community. There are divisions, and sometimes serious divisions within the Black community. And that has played into this larger thing. Okay, go ahead, Heather. Sorry.
No, you're right. And to answer your question, Martha, Davidson is not divided into districts. So each of the current commissioners, they're all kind of at large. And I don't know, Mary, was it ever set up in a district format?
No, there was an attempt to do it by breaking at least some of it up. And the way the numbers worked at that point, it was either going to be, there was some talk of doing like 2 at large, 3 by district. At that point, there wouldn't have been enough necessarily. Again, when the Black community isn't willing to, we shouldn't expect the Black community to talk with one voice any more than we expect the white community to talk with one voice. And I was on a committee to look into the possibility. It was Susan Roberts and I, maybe Shelley Rigger, I think was on the, maybe it was Shelley and I, and a couple other people. And we got just really lambasted from all sides about how they didn't want to be in districts. And I think part of the fear was that it would split the River Run community even more into a separate, looking out at talking about their interests rather than the interest of the whole. And the thought at the time was that if everybody represented everybody, that we would keep our eyes more on what was good for the town as a whole, rather than on particular segments.
It is true also that Garfield Carr was representing, or was an African American on the council for many years. And I don't know what good forces coalesced to have that happen, but there has not been, since Garfield Carr retired, any Black member that I know of.
Well, I'm just saying, if I were a member of the Black community, I would find that very off-putting.
There had been efforts every couple of years when it's time to have elections again, where folks have very, very strongly requested that some of our Black Davidson citizens run for town board. And at this point, we're not getting any takers. The personal splits that exist in the African American community in Davidson have prevented some of the folks from even considering it, which is really unfortunate. I mean, we've got really strong women with the Houston family
and Ruby Houston has been asked every other year she'll run. And she just doesn't, number one, she hasn't had time from her school position, but also she just didn't want to face some of the hostility that she would face from the other side. And it is a problem. It's a terrible problem. And also the fact that our West Side population is older. And so we don't have as many, or we don't have many at all, middle-aged folks who have the energy to go through an election and then to serve as a council person. So those are some excuses. They're not good excuses, but they are kind of an explanation that people who are in positions of not power, but influential in the town and can talk to a lot of folks about running. They've made efforts, but at this point, they haven't been able to succeed on that. I'm not making excuses for Davidson at all, because I don't like it either at all. But it is kind of a historical thing right now. And maybe somebody will step to the forefront next election. That would be a beautiful thing.
No, it's just the demographics, John. It's just the demographics. All right, I'm on census.gov right now, and Davidson is 92% white. Okay, the median home price in Davidson is $423,000. Okay, we've been talking about these systematic racial impediments that have been holding people of color back for a long time. And I think that has a lot to do with your lack of Black and minority representation in local government there in Davidson. But Mayor Knox, I think, is a member of DCPC. The mayor needs to be in this group this morning.
He does. Well, the other thing that goes back to the economics is in order to serve on the town council, you do have to have some time. And you have to have a job that will support your family and leave you spare time, or you have to have had a good enough job that you can retire early enough to participate. And the economics in the Black community are not following along those lines.
We have about 10 minutes left, and I have one more quote I want us to look at from Dr. Williams, and it's a rather long quote, so I've got it written out for you. Make sure I find it. Yep, here it is. And I will read it. You all see it?
Yep.
Christianity has been a mobilizing engine for the practice of idealized humanity, which is basically white supremacy. The church has a sick, twisted history. For all the good that it is possible, a whole lot of evil has also come through sanctuary doors. We have some belief issues, we have some trust issues, we have some fear issues, we have criminal issues, we have some human dignity issues. These issues of wrong belief obliterate the message of the gospel, which promotes human dignity. At some point in history, people broke covenant and chose to dehumanize people groups by stealing them and terrorizing them into slavery. The vision that brings up in my mind, as I imagine it, is horrifying. Love was lost and fear became the force used to manipulate and control lives in many ways. This is the table Jesus flipped. This is the wrong side up way.
John, could you circulate that for all of us, please? You know, I mean, so I can get my own copy. I'd like that.
I'll put it, I will email that to you as a PDF after the class is over.
I just did a screen print.
So what do we do with that?
I just, when I spoke earlier, I talked about how we are flawed and failed individuals, and that phrase, the thing you put up there was perfect to that point. We broke covenant. I just found that a very powerful phrase, and one I want to hold in my head.
In this week's message from the church, there was a link to a story to Robert's sermon today. I don't know how many of you read it, but if you read it, and you should, it's a hard look in the mirror, and you hope that that's not us.
But that might be metaphorical too.
Mm-hmm. I've not seen that yet, Ben. I'll have to go in and look at it. Thank you.
John, I want to ask a question about preparation for serving in a church. Do you think there is a division between generations as to way people are prepared to be in the church today, no matter whether it's in a multiracial church community or whether it's in a predominantly white? What do you think you're seeing how people are educated to serve?
Oh gosh.
I'm not just thinking Presbyterian. I'm thinking about what we hear a lot in the more fundamentalist community, saving of souls and individualizing faith.
Yeah, you know, I'm so far removed from schooling these days, but you know, from what I can tell from seminary students today, they have such a larger worldview than I would ever had when I was going through school. And I mean, even theology classes are much larger of a worldview. And I mean, when I went through, and Robert and I were, you know, took theology together, you know, we were just, you know, on the cusp of taking liberation theology. We had nothing. We didn't take anything on Black theology or womanist theology. That wasn't even a thing back then, 20 some years ago. So I think at least for the Presbyterian seminaries, which would be the only thing that I could really speak to, have a much more gracious and larger worldview. They're coming out. The church has just hired a seminary intern to work in the youth program for the summer, and she has a much larger worldview than I would have ever had.
Yeah, to echo John's point, I went to seminary up north. I went to Princeton, and even there, I mean, I had to take the courses that I took in womanist theology and liberation theology were electives. They weren't part of the core theological training. So, and that was 25 years ago.
Yeah, I would echo that too. That, I mean, for us, it wasn't a thing. I did go to school in Richmond in the South. So that was not,
Yeah.
that was not for us. Yeah, I guess the one thing I would like to say as we get ready to wrap up, you know, I think it's often when we, I'm going to go back to my screen for a minute. When we, you know, read a quote like this, it is often, sometimes when I read something like this, almost, I almost get caught up like I don't know what to do, because it's so damning for us as white Christians. But what I would hope is that we don't get caught up, and that as we continue, we're what, 4 weeks into this now, and this is good work. This is faithful work. This is hard work, that we continue to do this hard work that we are involved in, and know that this is just the first steps, that we will continue to just continue to see where God is leading us and where we're going. You know, it's interesting. I saw, you know, several weeks ago, Peter in his sermon talked about the Confederate statue in front of the United Methodist Church in Cornelius. And I saw in the Charlotte Observer the other day where that church is calling for its removal. The pastors and the administrative board want it gone from in front of their church. So I think we are on the right path, and we will continue to see where we're going. I do want to know,
John, excuse me. I'm sorry to jump in.
One second, Joe. I do want to point out something that Heather wrote in the group chat, and I thought it was true. I know we have at least one Davidson commissioner that's watching on the YouTube side, and I know I thought that was happening. So we do have church members that are on the town council. So thank you. Sorry, Joe, go ahead.
Yeah, so some of us on this group are in Unity and Community. It's an interracial group here in Davidson, Huntersville, Cornelius. Tuesday night at 6 o'clock, from 6 to 7, we are doing a protest in front of that statue. So we're going to be there, and if any of you would like to be there, it's a chance. It's going to be a peaceful protest to ask the statue be taken down. So this is a chance. Oh yes, come with masks, and we'll do social distancing and all of that. But since you mentioned it, I wanted you to say anybody who wants to be part of it can be part of it Tuesday night at 6 o'clock.
Tuesday night, 6 o'clock in Cornelius. Thank you. Well, thank you. I've asked anybody else, any last closing?
I've been waving my hand. I'm sorry.
Sorry, Linda. Go ahead.
Okay. I wanted to get back real quickly to what Brad said about the whole economic. We watched The Help again last night, and the movie The Help. And one of the maids needs $75 to get her twins' tuition through. She was trying to get her twins into college that had just graduated with honors. And of course, the person wouldn't think of loaning her any money because she needed to pull up by her own bootstraps. But I just think what I heard Heather mention just briefly about a capital campaign. I don't think people want handouts as much as they want a lift up, and even having a loan fund that could do, you know, sort of the little things that people need, I think is just really important. The other thing I just wanted to say is I read in the church magazine from the Presbyterian Church that the church in Charlotte, as a way of looking at reparations, has asked the city for some city-owned property to be made available for low-income housing. And that could be part of the city's reparation, and then the church could be in partnership in building it. Anyway, the economic, I think, is quite important. So I just wanted to back that up.
Thank you. I've asked Carolyn Knoll to close us
Gary,
in
you're
prayer.
muted. Gary, you're muted.
Oh, wait a minute. Gary, you got something you want to say before we pray?
Well, I was just going to say that if any of you watch Hamilton, which is on the Disney Plus channel right now, also watch at the end of it, the yellow tab. And it talks, as you know, that was produced in 15, but it was, they used Black actors to portray Washington and Jefferson. And the reason for that was to try to, make change. And if you listen to the play at the end, there's some extras and there's a yellow tab and the actors are able to talk about, what their feelings were about this issue. So it's an interesting way to do it. And I would suggest all of you give that a go if you watch Hamilton. That's all.
Thank you. Carolyn, can you close us in prayer?
Yes. Father, we face such a hard task, like a huge dark room that we don't know how to see our way into. And we need your Holy Spirit. When we think we are making progress, we may be being paternalistic. We may be wanting to make decisions for other people. We want to give them what we think they need. We need your Spirit to come into our hearts, to help us do the hard work of change, to recalibrate our thinking. Help us, Father, to be a part of turning the table upside down, of seeing the people with their backs against the wall as the people that you want us to help. We thank you for your love. We thank you for your guidance. And we thank you for hearing us as we ask for your help. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thank you, Carolyn. Friends, it's good to see you. Worship is in 10 minutes, and we will see you next week.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Carolyn. Bye, everybody.